Jamie Raskin leaned into the microphone and asked the one question Republicans couldn't answer: who are you protecting?
In that instant, the hearing room froze.
It wasn't just a political jab, it was a moral challenge that echoed far beyond the walls of Congress. Survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse had traveled to Washington, demanding the release of files that could finally expose the truth. Yet lawmakers hesitated, dodged, and delayed. The committee was debating the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, a bill meant to help victims unfairly criminalized. On paper it sounded noble, but to survivors watching from the gallery, the contradiction was painful.
All the Epstein files are released. My Republican colleagues have put forward multiple bills this markup that reflect what they say is a renewed focus on protecting kids against trafficking and exploitation. Well, this is the test. If our colleagues are serious, and I believe they are, then they should be happy and eager to join me in supporting this amendment. The text before you is the same text as Mr. Massey and Mr. Khanna's discharge petition that every Democrat and 4 of our Republican colleagues have joined in. In just the last 48 hours, we've seen how important it is that the public actually get to see the Epstein files for ourselves. The Oversight Committee has received Mr. Epstein's entire 50th birthday book, courtesy of Mr. Epstein's estate. This includes the now infamous and slightly juvenile birthday note and drawing that President Trump denied existed at all. In fact, he sued the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion for reporting that Trump had written this suggestive and lascivious note with the drawing of well, perhaps an underage girl's body, hard to say exactly what it is, but in that note he draws an outline of a woman's naked body, a young woman's naked body, wishes Jeffrey Epstein happy birthday, and then ends it with, "May every day be another beautiful secret." Well, this is now public, and it clearly includes the president's signature. He's disputing that it's his signature, but it looks exactly like about 100 other signatures that we have from the president, including on federal legislation. So let's not allow this to be another beautiful secret before we proceed. Let's open up the Epstein files. The book also includes some disturbing, never before seen images that appear to depict Epstein grooming young girls. It includes a never before seen document where Epstein and a longtime Mar-a-Lago member are joking about selling a woman, a quote, fully depreciated woman, to Donald Trump for $22,500. You can see it yourself if you have any doubt about it. Look, it's time for all of us to decide, Democrats and Republicans alike. The country is unified around this. Are we going to be on the side of transparency and accountability, or are we going to be on the side of the human traffickers and those who collaborate with them and collude with them and protect them? There is a stench of corruption, predation, and exploitation that now hangs over this whole matter. And we are seeing one of the greatest cover-ups of our century unfolding in real time. Which side are we on? And that cover-up, of course, starts with Alex Acosta, Donald Trump's Secretary of Labor, who gave Epstein a ridiculous plea bargain, ending the federal case against him for no apparent reason other than his wealth, his connections, his political power. There was a multi-count federal indictment ready to go, and Alex Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of Florida, gave it up and instead traded it for 1 count of solicitation. It didn't even mention child sex trafficking. 1 count of solicitation under Florida state law. He got the sweetest of sweetheart contracts. He was free in the daytime for several months, and then he went and spent the night in jail. And allegedly, he continued his criminal activities, grooming and procuring girls and having sex with underage girls and young women. So, this is about corruption. This is about the wealthy and powerful being able to manipulate the American justice system to get away with their crimes against kids. Let's release the file to the public. Vote yes on this, everybody. Let's make some history today. Let's make some history that we are going to see that the Epstein files actually come to light. That's what America wants. The most liberal people, the most conservative people, people across the spectrum want to see the files. We don't want dribs and drabs of the files they want us to see. We want the files they don't want us to see. We want the entire case file that they've got. Let's clear the air. Let's get the truth and the facts out there. Let's put an end to this corruption and cover-up. Let's do it on a bipartisan basis. I hope my colleagues will support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California, does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's amendment would introduce...
Yeah, so, Mr. Chairman, I fail to see
Gentleman is
how,
recognized to speak to his objection.
I fail to see how the gentleman's obvious case of Trump derangement syndrome has anything to do with this bill affecting immigration law. It's therefore not germane. I also question whether the gentleman's vicious attack on the president's character is in violation of the House rules, but I'll stick with the germaneness question for now.
Does the gentleman wish to speak on...
I certainly do. I don't know what deranged Trump syndrome is because I've not met with his psychiatrist, so I don't know what you're referring to with deranged Trump syndrome. In any event, you haven't contradicted a single fact that I put forward. It seems like you want to try to impinge on my free speech rights or my speech and debate rights. That's a bizarre turn of events, given that we've just been talking about the First Amendment and freedom of speech. But in any event, this is completely material and relevant. It's about the Acosta deal is about providing immunity from federal prosecution to Epstein and all of his unnamed co-conspirators. They were protected by that sweetheart deal. And this is about child sex trafficking, and the legislation is all about the protection of children. I don't see how it could be more aligned with the legislation here. Look, if you oppose it, if you don't want the file coming out, at least have the backbone and the courage to stand up and say you don't want it coming out. But don't say this isn't relevant to the protection of children. Give me a break. I yield back.
How could Congress claim to stand with them while simultaneously refusing to sign a petition to release the very files that mattered most? Raskin's words cut to the heart of the issue. The Epstein case has always been bigger than one man. It's about the networks around him, the banks that moved his money, the agencies that looked away, and the powerful figures who benefited from silence. The survivors weren't asking for favors, they weren't begging for sympathy. They were demanding transparency, because without it justice remains a hollow promise. The room shifted uncomfortably as Raskin pressed the point. If members of Congress wouldn't sign, then who exactly were they protecting? The answer was left hanging, unanswered, but its weight filled the chamber. Everyone knew what was at stake, and that was just the beginning. Because the truth is, Epstein didn't build his empire alone. He operated in plain sight, shielded by a web of enablers. And that web, more than Epstein himself, is what survivors and Americans are demanding to see exposed. But the story didn't end with a single question. It revealed a system hiding in plain sight. Jeffrey Epstein was not an isolated predator. He was the tip of an iceberg, and below the surface was a sprawling network that made his crimes possible. Survivors have said it again and again. Epstein relied on institutions, money pipelines, and powerful allies. Without them, his operation couldn't have lasted decades. Investigations showed that millions flowed through Deutsche Bank accounts tied to Epstein with little oversight. Regulators flagged some transactions, but warnings were ignored. Survivors described modeling agencies as convenient fronts, vehicles to lure victims under the pretense of opportunity. And then there was the infamous immunity deal brokered years ago by then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta. That agreement shielded unnamed co-conspirators from prosecution, granting protection not just to Epstein, but to others in his orbit. This is why the files matter. They're not just paper, they're a roadmap. Names, dates, transactions, and connections reveal patterns, and patterns reveal networks. A single name may not prove guilt, but when those names are placed together, the structure becomes undeniable. And that's what terrifies people in positions of power. Survivors believed the files could expose not only individuals but also the institutions that allowed Epstein to thrive. It's why silence has become the default posture. It's why lawmakers resist transparency. Because once the files are out, the story is no longer about one man, it becomes a story about a system. Raskin's question, "Who are you protecting?" suddenly looks larger than politics. It points to the banks that looked away, the agencies that failed, the deals that covered tracks. Protecting Epstein's legacy means protecting all of that. And that's what survivors and the public refuse to accept. But the most shocking signal wasn't in a file, it was in how Ghislaine Maxwell was treated after conviction. Survivors were stunned when Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's longtime partner in crime, was moved from her prison in Florida to a minimum security facility in Texas. The prison's nickname, Club Fed, says it all. For women who had suffered through years of silence, seeing Maxwell transferred to an easier environment felt like betrayal. Some even warned it looked like witness tampering. Now, legally speaking, no evidence has confirmed that. But optics matter, especially when trust in the justice system is already hanging by a thread. Survivors traveled to Washington, hoping their voices would lead to real change, only to watch Maxwell land in a setting many described as lenient. This wasn't a minor detail. Maxwell wasn't a footnote in Epstein's story, she was a central figure. Prosecutors called her a co-conspirator, survivors said she was instrumental in luring and grooming victims, and yet her transfer suggested preferential treatment. To survivors, it was a painful reminder that power still bends the system. The outrage wasn't just about Maxwell herself, it was about what her transfer symbolized: leniency for the powerful and endless hurdles for the vulnerable. At the very moment survivors demanded accountability, the government seemed to hand a lighter sentence to the one woman they saw as Epstein's closest accomplice. And that raised the same question again: who's being protected here? If survivors are still forced to fight for recognition, while perpetrators receive cushioned treatment, then the system's priorities are clear. For those watching from the outside, the message was chilling. Justice wasn't blind, it was selective. And the people who had suffered most were the ones left behind. But if Maxwell's transfer raised eyebrows, the real storm swirls around the sealed Epstein files themselves. The Epstein files have become a symbol of secrecy. Survivors, journalists, and even members of Congress want them released. The question is, why are so many fighting to keep them hidden? Reports suggest the files could include flight logs, financial statements, correspondence, and Epstein's notorious birthday book, a directory of names and contacts. A name in those files doesn't prove wrongdoing, but patterns matter. Who flew with him repeatedly? Who wired money? Who visited his properties? These are the threads that, when pulled together, can unravel the larger story. That's why survivors are adamant. For them, the files aren't about revenge, they're about truth. They believe exposure is the only way to dismantle the system that allowed Epstein to thrive. Without transparency, they fear history will repeat itself. But transparency terrifies the powerful. Once released, the files could implicate people across industries, finance, politics, media, even entertainment. Not necessarily with crimes, but with proximity, with association, with negligence. And in the court of public opinion, those connections can be devastating. This is why lawmakers resist. This is why petitions stall. Because the files aren't just about accountability, they're about the image of institutions, they're about reputations that could crumble if certain links come to light. Survivors don't care about reputations, they care about justice. They've endured enough to know that silence only protects predators. The files, they believe, are the key to ending that silence once and for all. And yet, while politicians argue, another contradiction emerges: money. Because while transparency is blocked, the financial networks that enabled Epstein are still being ignored. And following the money reveals another layer of complicity. If names raise eyebrows, money tells the story. Epstein's empire wasn't built on charm alone, it was sustained by financial systems that either failed to notice or chose not to act. Reports showed Deutsche Bank processed millions in transactions tied to Epstein, many flagged as suspicious. Regulators raised concerns, but enforcement was weak. The money flowed anyway. These weren't small transfers, they were substantial, consistent, and in some cases clearly structured to avoid scrutiny. Financial records are powerful because they don't lie, they reveal patterns of spending, funding sources, and payouts. Survivors argue that without banks turning a blind eye, Epstein couldn't have operated on such a scale. Money kept the jets fueled, the properties maintained, and the silence bought. And yet, despite the mountain of financial evidence, accountability has been limited. Institutions have paid fines, but individuals rarely face consequences. The system treats money as an inconvenience, not as the enabler of exploitation. This is why Raskin's question cuts so deep. Who are you protecting when you block the files? Who are you protecting when financial institutions escape real punishment? The answer looks less like justice and more like a shield for the powerful. For survivors, the frustration is unbearable. They know money enabled their abuse, but they also know money continues to protect those who benefited. And as if that weren't enough, another betrayal is unfolding, not in the courts, but in the very programs meant to help survivors heal. While lawmakers argue about transparency, survivors face a quieter crisis. Their support systems are being dismantled. Across the country, shelters, hotlines, and advocacy groups are running out of funds. In recent months, the Department of Justice removed human trafficking grant information from its website, making it harder for organizations to apply. At the same time, hundreds of grants were cut or terminated, slashing budgets for groups that provide shelter, counseling, and legal help. Consider Hope and Healing in Ohio, a nonprofit that supports women escaping abuse. Federal grants once made up the majority of its funding. Without them, staff face layoffs, programs shut down, and survivors lose lifelines. Multiply that story across states, and the picture is grim. For survivors, it feels like a double betrayal. They're denied justice when files remain hidden, and now they're denied safety when programs close. The government claims to support victims with new legislation, yet behind the scenes it guts the very resources victims depend on. This contradiction is devastating. Survivors watch lawmakers argue about transparency while shelters close their doors. They hear promises about justice while losing the advocates who help them rebuild their lives. It's a cruel cycle, one that reinforces the sense that the system is built to protect power, not people. And this makes Raskin's question echo louder: who are you protecting? Because if the answer isn't survivors, then the system is protecting someone else. And that brings us to the political hypocrisy at the heart of this fight. The loudest hypocrisy is also the simplest. Many lawmakers once demanded the Epstein files be released. They shouted about transparency, accountability, and justice. But when Donald Trump reversed his stance, silence spread like wildfire. Suddenly, transparency wasn't a principle, it was a bargaining chip. Raskin called it what it is: protecting predators, co-conspirators, and institutions. By refusing to sign the petition, lawmakers aren't shielding survivors, they're shielding the powerful. The message is clear: politics first, justice second, and survivors feel that betrayal. They hear speeches about supporting victims while watching real opportunities for justice vanish. They see programs cut, files locked, and perpetrators cushioned with leniency. For them, the fight is no longer about one man, it's about whether America values survivors at all. That's why Raskin's question lingers: who are you protecting? If lawmakers can't answer honestly, the public already knows the truth. They're not protecting survivors, they're protecting reputations, institutions, and power. But here's the reality: survivors have shown more courage than Congress. They've stood up after unimaginable trauma. They've demanded transparency when it was easier to stay silent. If they can risk everything to tell the truth, then the least the rest of us can do is echo their voices. This isn't just about Epstein, it's about whether we protect the vulnerable or the powerful, about whether justice means anything when it collides with politics. So ask yourself the same question Raskin asked Congress: who are you protecting? If the answer is anything other than survivors, then justice has already failed.